Hi, and welcome to another webinar about software supply chain security. Today I'm being joined by Imran Mohammed, the CEO and founder of Practical-Devsecops, a company providing DevSecOps training and certification program. Other than being the CEO, which is a busy job in and of itself, Imran is the founder of Null Singapore, an information security community there, where he has organized more than 60 events and workshops to spread security awareness, a worthy cause that we can all get behind. Now, the reason that we're having this webinar is because, as we all know, software supply chain security is constantly on the news. People care. And there's not a lot of actual courses or certification plans out there. One of the first ones that we encountered is the one by DevSecOps. So, Imran, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
I would like to start, right off the bat by how do you define software supply chain security?
Sure. First off, thank you so much, Barak, and the rest of the team for having me today. And pretty excited to talk about software supply chain. Obviously, a very important topic in the current scenario and current state of the industry right now, with major attacks like SolarWinds and Chekhov and all of that. So sure, happy to be here. So yeah, the way I would define the supply chain in general, and if I want to borrow the definition from NIST, they do define it as a linked set of assets and processes, which is used across the enterprise to create a software to achieve some business goals. And in that context, we could define software supply chain as anything and everything which is used to create a software, be it a version control system, a CI/CD system, or a production system for that matter, right? And thanks to the recent attacks, let's say, for example, LastPass, the developer machines are also part of now the DMZ, so to say. So it's a very important topic, and definitely there needs to be a lot of awareness in the industry, specifically with software supply chain security. Yeah, so that's how I would define it. Anything which is, to sum it up, basically, anything that impacts the creation, maintenance, and use of a software could be stated as software supply chain security. Yeah,
it's definitely very wide in a definition. Who's the course intended for? Who's your prospective students?
Sure. So since the definition is wider, obviously the audience is also quite wide. So this course is primarily designed for developers, DevOps people, and then security professionals. And the reason why we include, and it's a broad scope, how can you satisfy 3 different personas, 3 different audiences with wide variety of job roles and responsibilities. And the reason why we wanted to do this was because we do talk a lot about security is everyone's responsibility as an industry, but we also wanted to showcase it in the concept or with respect to software supply chain. So how does that fit into broader software supply chain? The responsibility to create code securely is of the developers, whereas to take the code which was developed securely, to put it into production is the responsibility of developers. And to ensure that there are no software security vulnerabilities in it, and to ensure that we stay compliant to different standards and compliances and laws, is the overall responsibility of a compliance or a security team. So it's very important in the context of both supply chain and also DevSecOps and shift left that we start thinking about this problem from the very beginning. Where it all started, we started creating code. So it makes sense that developers understand what could go wrong if they don't take security in mind, or they don't place security in mind in the context of they developing a code. Similarly, DevOps and security. And of course, I do realize developers might not have a lot of say in terms of figuring out which tools would be used to deploy or which cloud we would be using in order to run the systems. Whereas security wouldn't have a lot of say in saying, hey, I would like you to pick up AWS because it's secure by default, or some Azure because it complies with FedRAMP or whatnot. Each one of them have some say, so it's very important we consider the security and especially of the supply chain, because a lot of moving pieces and it's a broad definition. Everyone is part of this problem, and so everyone should be part of the solution as well. So it definitely caters to these three different personas. And then our aim, as I said, is to make sure that everyone is aware of the risks they have in each part or components of supply chain. And once they understand their roles and responsibilities in the broader software supply chain, they would be able to uh, sort of categorize and divide their responsibilities accordingly. For example, maintaining of a cloud could be a responsibility, a combined responsibility of dev and security team, operations and security team. And then taking care of cluster could be again responsibility of developers and security folks. And code and containers could become responsibility of dev and QA. So yeah, so that's how we have designed the course and intend, and this is for three personas: dev, DevOps, and security folks. Yeah.
It sounds like it would be easier for companies to deal with this issue if there was one job, like there is a CISO whose job it is to deal with security issues. If there was one job, let's call it, for the sake of argument, the software supply chain security officer of the company. Is there even a job? Let's say that I'm a student and I'm learning development. I haven't started my career path yet. Is there a job that I can apply to? Is there a specific? I have now finished your course. I have the certificate. Can I apply for a specific job? Because I'm not sure if I want to deal with development or with DevSecOps or just security or compliance. There, like you said, there's a lot of moving parts. Is there like a singular job that you can aim for that deals with the whole issue from like a top-looking view?
Sure. Unfortunately, we do have such a role, but we don't call it as a supply chain security expert, right? We would call them as a security automation engineer or DevSecOps engineer, where they not only know the pieces from the development side of things and operation side of things, but they also know a bit of the security as well. And the security champions, which should be an integral part of any software security program, could be a good avenue, could be a good role to really learn about software supply chain. However, as I said before, each one of us, irrespective of we are a dev or a security engineer or a DevOps engineer, should and must know what are the threats. And of course, DevOps can pick up some of the security responsibilities, at least with the help of a program like Security Champions, and then learn these things. So this obviously something for everyone. But however, having said that, this course or this role would not be a fit for someone who's just starting their career. They don't have a knowledge about how the software is built, created, maintained, and run. Then probably that's not for them. Someone who's just starting or joining a company right out of their college. Yeah, definitely not. We would want someone who has a couple of years of experience, maybe 2 to 3 years of experience, would be good fit for this particular role. Yeah.
Okay. Now that we talked about the personas that are going to hopefully take the course, learn what they need to about securing their software supply chain, what's the course philosophy? How do you set out to build such a course, considering the vast number of threats and systems and attack surfaces? It's a very complex issue, like you said, with the three different personas. So how do you put everything together?
Sure. Since we have a Herculean task in front of it, so what we definitely did before we started the course was to take a step back and thought, hey, how can we convince 3 different set of people with a wide variety of responsibilities to kind of put their minds and heart in? So we said, okay, so we probably should design the course in an attack-first approach, which means we would first define who we are defending the whole supply chain against. Are you a nation state? Are you an organized crime organization? And again, based on who you are, for example, if you are in a big enterprise, your attack surface and threat model will be completely different from an individual, right? If you are a nation state, maybe you are, you are trying to get a submarine blueprint. Whereas if you're just an individual, maybe you're just trying to log in or compromise Facebook password, right? Quite common scenario these days. So we start off with the threat model or attack-first approach, where we really look into it, what an attacker is trying to achieve here. And then using that, we define, again, we borrow some of the CNCF philosophy of 4 Cs, which stands for cloud, cluster, container, and code. So now you could really think about, like, hey, what are the attacks which could happen because of supply chain? Of course, cloud in itself is a supply chain, right? What are the different attacks which could happen in this supply chain? And how can we defend against all of these, right? As I said, all of these, okay, we'll come back to that word all. It's quite broad term, and obviously we know we cannot secure against all the attacks. Attackers just have to find one loophole, and defenders have to guard against n number of vulnerabilities. Definitely a big problem to solve. However, if we do look at in a broader sense, like, hey, we are creating a castle, can we have multiple layers of security so the castle cannot be taken down by just ramming against the door and getting into the production environment? Yeah. So we built the multiple layers of security in the cloud layer, on the cluster layer, which means orchestration, Kubernetes, what have you. And then we look at how do you package it together in a container, and then finally in the code. And each one of them have their own problems. For example, we'll take an example. Containers suffer from old packages which have vulnerabilities. And honestly, I never find any Ubuntu package that doesn't have any low or medium vulnerability of some sorts. Whereas code, they suffer from, once again, third-party components, like you have a vulnerable component like Apache, or you have vulnerable components or some other third party you're using. So attack surface is huge. How can we deal with it in a reasonable way? What do? We look at attacks, and then how we can defend against and create multiple layers of security in place, irrespective of what technology you're using and what stack you have. Yeah. So that's how I would go about. That's how we design the course. Yeah.
Cool. So, like you said, a lot of, like both of us said, a lot of different stacks and technologies, but Seeing has basically, I'm guessing that almost every single potential student that comes from a company that has a different stack, different technology, different programming languages, platforms, even if 2 students are using the same stack and the same languages, they probably have different processes that they're running. How can you take all these different moving pieces and create a homogenized course from it that can answer and cater to everybody's different needs?
Great question, and I get asked a lot of the same question. Yeah, the first thing, as I mentioned before, we take an attack first approach, which means we definitely know that someone is behind us and they are interested either in the submarine's blueprint, or they're interested in the data, the credit card data. And once we have that information, now we can decide what is my risk management methodology. Would I want to invest $100 million to protect a simple blog database? Obviously, I wouldn't, right? It's just a blog. It's open, publicly available, unless you are doing some shady stuff. You're not really worried about that. So you take a common sense approach of how I can defend against these things. Now, coming back to the technologies, And I would say even within the enterprise, every business unit runs like its own startup. So within an organization, you definitely talked about different organizations. I will take an example of an same organization having different business units. Some of them would be using GitLab, some of them would be using Jenkins, you name it. You would have n number of technologies, and supporting them becomes a very, very difficult task. And that's just for the CI/CD systems. Now, if you talk about programming languages, you have Python, Golang, you name it, Ruby and whatnot. And that's why a lot of organizations, including Netflix, they said, hey, we would want to walk on a paved path, and this is a path we would want you to go in a jungle or a forest. If you do differentiate or move from here and there, you might be susceptible to bear attacks or whatnot. Similarly, what we did do that is, what are some of the common things which we can take from different supply chain best practices, laws, and regulations? If you talk about the Executive Order 14028 or NIST 800-161, or you have SALSA, Secure Software Development Framework, or you have CIS benchmark. Yeah, I tend to say CSI, probably too much of TV, but yeah. So CIS, Software Supply Chain Security Guide. So we took all them together and say, what are some commonalities which we can find in each of them? For example, one of the best practice to guard against untrusted and malicious packages being used as part of your build process or development process is to have a good binary repository manager. Maybe it's like a JFrog or an SS or some sort of Docker registry, where your developers and ops is not just using any package which is available online, untrusted package, and then just using it in the code. Yeah, it becomes a huge attack vector when it comes to supply chain. So how do we defend against it? Common sense security. You have a secure binary repository, which ensures there are policies applied, there are scannings which are being done, the SBOM being created, and so on and so forth. So that's how we would like to look at the problem of different technologies, technical stacks, programming languages, and CI/CD systems.
Speaking of CI/CD systems, because CI/CD systems are one of the main attack vectors in most complex systems, because you need to actually have courses, classes, examples shown to students. Which platforms and cloud environments does the course cover? Do you mainly focus, for example, on GitHub, which is one of the best well-known platforms around, or are you doing some of the more like other platforms, both in the SCM, in the cloud, and in the CI/CD? I don't know, Circle CI, Jenkins, Azure. There's a whole bunch of them. I'm guessing that if you want to really cover all your bases in terms of cloud, you need to do at least the big three, which are Amazon, Google, and Microsoft. But again, the more you add, the more complex the course becomes. And some people who come from a company that only works with, I don't know, Amazon would say, yeah, but I don't want to learn about Microsoft and Google. I'm not using them. I don't need this stuff. How do you, again, put all that together?
Sure. Yeah, a big problem, right? Okay, so again, we could really think about this problem in two ways. What kind of customers do we really get? Or maybe what kind of organizations or enterprises we find? There are two types of organizations if you really look at like a 10,000 feet view of the organization. Some organizations are entirely on-prem. They would want to create, like banks or highly regulated environments or air-gap systems are a good example of this. They would like to do everything on-prem, obviously, because of the attack surface. And then we have another type of organizations who are very forward-looking. Everything is on cloud, zero trust security, and so on and so forth. So we picked up, hey, what are the different systems which are being used by organizations who are on-prem and on cloud? And we said, okay, GitLab and GitHub Actions are primarily two important SCM systems, which really look at DevOps first, take DevOps first approach. So we categorize that. But then we also have a lot of these old organizations, legacy organizations, who still use Jenkins CI. But then some of them also use Circle CI. However, the syntax honestly, the syntax for GitLab CI, Circle CI, Bitbucket CI, AWS Code Pipeline, Azure DevOps Pipeline is similar. It's not very different like Jenkins. They use a YAML. Yeah. When people say, especially security people, when we say security as code or compliance as code, they'll just are scared. Oh man, I don't know how to code. What can I do? It's just a fancy way of saying bunch of YAML files put together to run CI/CD systems. Yeah. So we use GitLab Actions, GitHub Actions, and wide variety of CI/CD systems, including Jenkins, Circle CI, and Bitbucket CI as well. Travis CI as well. Yeah.
All right. Definitely covers a lot of bases. Which is a good thing. The more different options you offer, the more well-rounded your students would eventually be. And you're right, YAML files do take care of most of those CI/CD systems. Now, how would your course offer, now that we're talking about CI/CD systems, and we did mention they're one of the major attack surfaces out there for most systems, how would your course offer to design and implement a CI/CD hardening, which could include adding tailor-made policies, homemade policies to the pipeline, basically making that pipeline as difficult to break or alter as possible?
Sure. Yeah. Again, one of the biggest challenge, as we discussed before, is how do we handle these different technologies in a meaningful manner without overwhelming ourselves, and without spending whole lot of money and resources. Yeah. So of course, the CI/CD is the holy grail, as you mentioned before, Barak. So it's a holy grail, and I would like to call CI/CD systems the glamorized remote code execution vulnerabilities. And honestly, that's what it is. You are running remote code or some code which is being instructed or created in YAML now, run it on some remote node, some sort of a shared server or a dedicated server, and you're running the code. And if an attacker running a remote code scares you, CI/CD should also scare you. So it should be imperative. And if you look at the major attacks, how did they manifest themselves? Checkov, SolarWinds, the central piece for all of this is CI/CD system. So it's very important that we harden the CI/CD system. So how do we deal with it? We have different standards, different best practices. And if you forget about these best practices and think about common sense, who should we give access to our source code version control system? Our employees, the people who trust, contractors, or someone like that. And then you would want to ensure that there is a strong authentication and authorization, access management, so to say, or identity management. Two of the biggest problems, I don't think anyone managed to figure out two problems: asset management and access management. So you would want to ensure that this is taken care of, identity and access management. And then once that is done, we also have to include hardening for version control systems, CI/CD systems, build systems, artifact management system. And we could do that with a tool like Scribe, where you ensure that once the code is created, no one can maliciously put in some remote code or middle shell or some sort of remote code execution vulnerabilities by using tool like Scribe, which allows you to implement and monitor CI/CD hardening to ensure that the entire organization, and with the help of policies, of course, can do that. If you have a budget, sure, you could do that, or you could also use the community edition of Scribe to do that. Now, if you have a lot of time, resources which you would like to spend, we can also accomplish this with the help of a open source tool. But it makes sense if you don't have expertise, sure, use a commercial tool. But if you know what you're doing, if you have a flexibility and availability and resources to do it, skills to do it, then you could use our amazing frameworks, our different security mechanisms, like we have MITRE's CI/CD attack metrics, which will showcase you from attacker's perspective what could go wrong in a CI/CD environment. That's one thing you could do. Or we also have OWASP project around this OWASP CI/CD top 10. You can look at that and see what are some common attack vector surfaces we have, and then defend against those things. And common problems which we usually see, if I have to summarize, CI/CD hardening needs to be done, sure. Access control, access management, access control. Also, you need to have a good logging mechanism. And honestly, no one, at least before we have Checkov and other SolarWind attacks, people really didn't pay attention to CI/CD security because it's in-house. No one is attacking it. And even now, for that matter, the easiest way to get in is third-party components, right? So it's not really looked into, but something we should all look into, thanks to the recent attacks and scenarios here. And on top of it, the common problems we typically see are credential leaks. And I have seen some of companies become bankrupt just because they leak their AWS key or a GitHub key on GitHub. A lot of examples of those things. CodeSpace is one such example. Yeah. And there wouldn't be any code signing. There's no anti-tampering or tampering-proof systems. There's no integrity checks on the systems as well, which is, I'll give an example. Okay, we were doing a pen test, and we were tasked to get the data information in the database. So we didn't target the admins or security people. We targeted developers. Why? Because they have access to repositories, and repositories drive pipelines, CI/CD systems. And once you attack and introduce an RCE in it or a command in it, you can get 200 shells. Unfortunately, I got only 200 shells. After that, my system crashed. I don't know how many systems I would have compromised, because the developer had a master access to the master branch, and he could then start a pipeline. The pipeline then built the artifact. That artifact went into production, and then production gave us the shell. It executed on the production system, and it gave a shell. Now, we could have prevented it if we could have hardened the CI/CD systems. You have approval processes in mind. You need two developers to say, hey, yes, we would like it to go to production. We protected the branch. We signed the code. Yeah? That's probably the holy grail of the defensive side of supply chain. You would want to ensure that the code is signed and compared against an external system, so that people cannot just insert whatever they feel like in the pipeline or in the code. Yeah. So that's probably some of the things which we could do to harden CI/CD system and version control systems.
Great. Just to mention that when you say signing, for those of our viewers who are not security fluent, we're talking about cryptographically signing, well, basically signing files or repositories or folders. After you cryptographically sign something, you can then verify that signature to make sure that the original object was not modified. And again, just because I can mention it, Scribe definitely has the capability to both sign and verify various things. But this is not a webinar about Scribe. So moving on to our next question. SSC systems, or SSC threats, actually. So SSC stands for software supply chain. SSC threats are a constantly evolving field, even though that some of the attacks or vulnerabilities that we see are old or new, actually new. They're using some old systems or old threats that are using new systems. Everything keeps happening over and over again, even though the basic attacks like backdoors and malwares and there's various things that could happen, but everything constantly changes. One of the most recent attacks that we've seen, I think in 3SC, was a chain of several vulnerabilities linked together, and only once you got all of them in the same environment would the vulnerability become actually exploitable. Because everything is constantly shifting and moving and reconfiguring, how can you offer students an effective way to deal with such a rapidly evolving field?
Sure. And before I answer that question, I would want to have some kind of disclaimer here. Okay, our course definitely is not a holy grail, number one, and we are definitely not securing ourselves from, let's say, very dedicated or nation state actors, of course. We are definitely not securing against zero-day vulnerabilities, right? So having said that, right, as a security or developer or a DevOps person, our job is to make sure we make it extremely difficult for an attacker to get inside our infrastructure or in our app, and then have, let's say, once you compromise one system, you would want information from other systems, so-called lateral movement. We want to ensure that we make it extremely difficult for them and extremely expensive. That's the word, right? Expensive for them to come to us and try to attack us. We make it extremely difficult for them. Once we make that, once we look at that from that perspective, and if I have to quote, big shots here, we want to go back to our first principles. What are the first principles? Once again, the threat modeling. Once again, who is behind us, what we are trying to protect against. Is it the customer data, credit card information, citizen information? Who we are trying to, prevent, what type of attacks we are trying to prevent, what type of data we want to secure. We take a step back. Now, let's talk about in a software supply chain context. What developers or security or attackers are against these days is CI/CD systems. Why? Because that's the easiest thing to attack these days. Remember, back in the days in 80s and 90s, we used to have remote code execution vulnerabilities in NetBIOS or IIS or Tomcat. Those days are gone. We don't find any RCE these days. So what attackers started doing is, since I cannot do this, let me try fool people. Salesperson opening up an Excel sheet, or a developer who has access to an SSH key of a GitLab. Yeah. So they are attacking developers where the security is not considered or not taken care of right now. Okay. Still, there's a lot of good things which happened after the recent attacks, but there's a lot to be desired these days because developer machines are still not considered to be part of DMZ. Honestly, it is. Right? That's how most attacks are happening. That's one avenue. The other avenue we have is third-party component. And Sonatype, there's a research by a company called Sonatype. They figured out that 90% of the code which you use in your software is external third-party code. The third-party code which you have no visibility into who's the author, what he does, is he alive or not. It opens up a whole can of worms, So how do we defend against these things? As I said, we create multiple layers of security in version control system with something like code signing. Then you implement CI/CD, which we discussed just now. Then we also want to ensure that we have a good secrets management system and a good system which provides like Scribe Hub, as Barak just mentioned, which allows us to do anti-tampering, preventing people from sneaking stuff into the build artifact. And then we would also want to ensure that the system which is deploying and the system which is verifying is not one the same. It would be foolish to say, okay, the person who is creating something is also the person who is auditing it, who's verifying this is working fine. Obviously, you will have bias. You would have to have systems which have separation of duties. That's a term we use, and so on and so forth. And of course, we want to ensure that we have a good threat intel and so on and so forth. Now, I would add here, we can achieve a lot of things with just free and open source and community versions which are available. However, keeping abreast of the latest developments is a job in itself. We have dedicated people who just look at threat intels, and that threat intel will fit in your SSC risk management philosophy. And having said that, I would also argue that these days pen tests or any security mechanism should be used as a way to harden and improve your existing security postures, at least with the help of the DevSecOps best practices. You have SAs, SCA, SAS, secret scanning, you name it. And there are, again, it seems complicated, daunting task to accomplish, but honestly, the open source community, the CNCF community is amazing. We have now amazing tools like Scribe also has a lot of these free open source tools which you can use, which allows you to find, scan image vulnerabilities in containers. Then you also have an amazing project called Sigstore, which allows you to build anti-tampering. We also have Intoto. We also have OPA, which is Open Policy Agent, which allows you to create policies, right? Stitching together, however, even though these are free, could be difficult, but you can do it. If you are at it, that's what we teach in the course. But we also showcase a tool like Scribe or other vendors as well, which allows you to accomplish this in a one single pane of window. So I think I'm just going on probably on a long tangent here. Over to you, Barak. Yeah.
Sure. We already mentioned SBOMs because SBOMs are one of the most important tools in many of the frameworks which you already mentioned, the SSDF, the other NIST frameworks, the original executive order in the US, which started this whole landslide of cybersecurity race, essentially. So saying how important SBOMs are for the software supply chain security, how would your course offer to establish SBOM creation automation? Because just creating them is relatively easy, but doing it automatically is slightly more involved. And how would you offer to your students to use these SBOM and the information they may contain once they're done? Because just having a bunch of JSON files on a folder on your desktop is probably not really useful for security reasons. But what exactly does your course offer in this regard?
Sure. So creation of software bill of material is probably the easiest problem to work with, but how do you manage it, deal with the complexities, and enforce the policy across the organization is probably the most important and complex problem we would have to deal with when it comes to SBOM. Once you have SBOM, creation is probably the easiest task to do. You could use native functionality in GitHub or GitLab or any tool for that matter. We have amazing projects from OWASP as well, which allows you to create this software bill of material and you get a JSON. Now, what do you do with this JSON? Right, that's the problem. And how do you deal with the amount of JSONs you have created? For example, typically, any organization creates our average age of a container in an organization is 12 hours, which means you are building these pipelines using GitOps or whatnot regularly. And some organizations are even pushing code to production every 5 seconds, which means you are creating SBOMs every 5 seconds. Obviously, you would have some packages which are outdated. They don't have patches or they don't have fixes. How do you deal with that complexity? This is where a good commercial software would be of help. But unfortunately, in the open source world, there's no software which manages this in a one single pane of view. We can stitch together things. We can work with a system like Defect Dojo, but it can only handle the software side of things. How do you deal with the infrastructure side of things? That can become quite daunting, as a thing. So yeah, coming back to the problem, creation is easy. Managing it, including the security assessment of the things, making sure we are keeping track of the state of each project can be quite daunting. We have seen customers build their own in-house portals for that. But yeah, and funny story, of course, one guy created it. He left the organization. No one uses it. Yeah. So that could be a problem. But sure, you could do it if you have a good team, you have resources, or you can use any commercial solution like Scribe here. Could be a good example for that. But having said that, GitLab and GitHub are working towards building the Salsa version 3 functionality and features natively. Okay. But even if you're not using GitHub, you could still achieve level 3, but you would have to do some work. That's what we teach. And then finally, we put you in paid or enterprise versions of GitLab and GitHub Actions. And of course, we give you access to the community edition. I mean, when I say give you action, but we encourage you to go sign up and then look at how the Scribe Trust Hub helps you achieving these goals as well. So yeah, we are talking about open source and then commercial. And the reason why we kept both open source and commercial tools is a lot of people complain saying that, hey, Imran, you are teaching about open source tools. We don't use open source in our company. It's not encouraged or frowned upon in some instances, like banks, for example. But others, they do love it. But irrespective of what budget you have, I would say this will add a lot of value. Okay, for example, we have Snick, which allows you to do a few things for free. You don't have to take money out of your pocket, for sure. And then Scribe allows you to do 100 builds per day, which is, I think, should be more than sufficient for a
I think it's 100 builds per month, I think.
Per month?
I think it's per month.
Oh, did I
If
say
you're a
day?
small company, yeah, you said day. If it's a
No,
small
no.
company, it's still more than enough.
Yeah, sure, definitely. So 100 bills per month should be more than enough. So yeah, yeah, I think that it is that.
Sure. Because you mentioned Scribe several times, and I should give adequate preface here that Scribe tooling and use cases are part of your course, because we spoke of previously. That's how we got to know you. What made you choose to add Scribe elements to your course in the first place? I mean, you came to us. You said that you might be able to use it. What made you choose to use Scribe as an example for your students?
Couple of reasons. As I mentioned before, we showcase how to achieve Salsa version 3 with the help of open source tools, mostly CNCF graduated projects and so on and so forth. Harbor, you have Anchor, you have you have Sixstore, Intoto, and whatnot. We showcase students with that, but the amount of efforts you need to put in are huge. Unless you have a big team, security team, a dev savvy team, you wouldn't be able to maintain it. And that's honestly a sad reality of it. Many security engineers don't know how to code. Many DevOps engineers do not have time to learn security, and so on and so forth. And sure, yeah, it seems counterintuitive, but it is what it is, honestly. So if you would like to save some time, which we all need, basically we don't have enough time to do all the things we need to do, you would want to. So we were exploring commercial solutions which allow you to test cases. We came across a lot of commercial tooling, but it was behind walled gardens, showing that they
Mhm.
didn't have any community edition or some sort of editions which they can see it in action and then believe that, hey, this is an important problem, this can be solved. And I think Stripe fit into right at there. And while you are learning, 100 builds are more than enough to see whole thing. And on top of that, we also saw that the tool supports CI/CD hardening and implementing policies across the organization, so you don't miss something like, hey, why we got attacked because this particular repository didn't had some policy enforced on it. So that's the reason why we added Stripe. And here again, this is not a pitch for Stripe, as we both agreed on. We do
Yeah.
have other solutions, but we love Scribe for, as I said, various reasons. It's free. It's open, 100 bells a month. It handles CI/CD hardening, anti-tampering, and anti-tampering, yeah, and policies, in general policies. And these are some of the things which our customers, enterprise customers, are looking for. How I can use a tool, so with minimum number of people. Like with the recession, it makes even more sense that we are short-handed. We don't have a lot of people at hand. So yeah, investing in a software as a um, security as a software as a service would certainly elevate some of the pain points which security professionals and DevOps people might face. So yeah, that's why I think we came across here.
Well, it's always good to hear,
Thank
because
you.
I work here. And it's,
Thank you.
um, yeah. Because you mentioned anti-tampering, and it's something that we do.
Mm.
Essentially, what would you offer a student who wants to implement an anti-tampering system in general, not just specifically anti-tampering for the CI/CD or anti-tampering for the SCM or anti-tampering for code, building a code platform, but essentially, what would you offer as an anti-tampering system philosophy or rule that would work for anything? Essentially, an anti-tampering system would not just be like building a wall. It should be able to tell you when an attacker tried to do something. It should alert you that something was modified when it's not supposed to. It should be more complex than just, this is a wall, nobody passes. But if somebody did pass, it doesn't do anything. What
Yeah,
would you offer for that?
sure. Yeah, definitely being the guardians of security wouldn't help in the in a broader scope of things. And security definitely have a bad repo because they are known as department of no. So we wouldn't want to do that. We want to look at how we can embed this sort of security first approaches from the left, shift left, DevSecOps, look at the problem from the very beginning. And fortunately, we do have anti-tampering systems on the production side of things. You have SSL and TLS, for that matter, is a sort of anti-tampering system. No one can do a man-in-the-middle attack, right? Can sneak in something. We do have this technology which we have been using. However, how can we apply this to software is the need of the hour. How can we do that? There are essentially two techniques. One technique can be implemented in a commercial solution. Other one could be implemented both in a commercial and non-commercial sort of scenario. I'll talk about the scenario which works for both commercial and non-commercial aspect of it, which is essentially you have two systems. A system which, and it obviously uses code signing, integrity checks to accomplish the whole goal. And the goal of the system is the person who is creating the code and putting into a system, then that particular code could be then taken up or unzipped and then verify that, hey, okay, the person who created this code did not introduce something which was not there in version control system, and then check it against, let's say, a secrets management system. I will come across why I said secret management system, but they also allow you to have, maybe you are using public key cryptography, or maybe you are using less complex version of it, which is to say, hey, we are just checking SHA checksums. If it is same, it means that no one has introduced some bugs, right? So we are checking, someone is creating the checksums, which is basically a proof of the system being zipped or archived. And another system is then taking that information and then making assertions that did the system or someone changed the zip or image or any kind of artifact, honestly. And if there is no change, if the checksums or the code signing matches, then you're golden. Otherwise, you have problems, you have a leak, we have security problem, and so on and so forth. And this can be quite daunting and quite complex as well. So we use a couple of softwares, a couple of open source software like HashiCorp Vault. We also use Sigstore, as I mentioned before. We also use Harbor, right, to accomplish this. How do we make sure the artifacts stays secure throughout the supply chain? Yeah. So does that answer the question, Barak? I'm not sure if I've answered it fully. What do you think?
Okay, you seem to have frozen.
How about now? Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, but now I can't see you.
Sure. I just disabled it, off the video, but okay, sure.
Okay. Hey, yeah. Now I can see you and hear you, which means our viewers can see you and hear you. We're almost out of time anyway, so I'll just finish with a more generalized question. We started by saying that software supply chain security is now of interest to basically everybody, not just in the US, but globally. And we have seen a new deluge of compliance regulations basically everywhere. Multiple systems have risen in the US. There's a new bill coming up in the EU. There are interests of this in Germany and, well, Germany is part of the EU, but Canada, various other places. Everybody's interested in what they can do to create a new baseline that all software producers can follow, a new best practice, a new way to make sure that the software supply chain everywhere is as secure as possible. The big question is, does your course deal with compliance to any all of these new regulations? Does finishing your course and applying what you learn in your organization can help you, or basically help the people who run the organization, like the CEO or the CISO, say, yes, we are secure, we comply with SALSA Level 3, which you already mentioned, with the SSDF, with CIS regulations, with the new EO bill, whatever. Does implementing what you learn help you with compliance?
Sure, it definitely does. And matter of fact, there is a new law now, which was passed in June 2022, last year. Yeah, exactly a year ago. And the law name is Supply Chain Security Training Act. Okay, and it fits nicely in the whole broader spectrum of why education is probably the first thing we need to do, and probably we need to learn in order to ensure that we are keeping our supply chains secure. And this became a law, as I said, in June 2022, but it alludes and uses a lot of these best practices from different frameworks. For example, as you mentioned, SALSA framework, we rely heavily on SALSA framework. We try to make sure that we are fulfilling all the requirements when it comes to the development, CI/CD and whatnot, with respect to the secure software development framework. Once again, from NIST, DoD. We also heavily rely on software component verification standard from OWASP, then supply chain security verification standard, once again from OWASP. And then it also satisfies many of the NIST guidelines of 800.161 and 800.218. Of course, it depends. Not all of them can be satisfied depending on who you are, what kind of infra you are in, and so on and so forth. Okay. So yeah, and I think, and there's also now a new act called, and I think it's not yet a law. However, and again, I'm not a lawyer, so please take it as with a bit of a salt. Grain of salt there. There's a new law which is being worked on, act which is being worked on, called Securing Open Source Software, once again from US. But however, there's a broader worry about supply chain attacks, especially in Australia, UK, Canada, and it's not just the software supply chain, but they are worried about the entire critical infrastructure, telecommunications, and whatnot. So this software supply chain fits nicely in all of these different regulations, standards, and laws. And this it is right now, at least in US, is a mandate that you need to ensure that you create SBOMs. You need to ensure that your software is free from vulnerabilities, but you would only see it becoming regulation or a standard in rest of the world as well. US and Europe certainly are at the forefront of this, but we are seeing a lot of efforts in Japan, Canada, Asia, here in Singapore, and Australia as well. So, and honestly, business is one of the risks for a business is making sure you're compliant to different regulations. If not, you have a business continuity problem, you have regulatory problems, and businesses are willing to invest in this, in this avenue, supply chain security. And you would see more and more professionals wanting to upskill themselves, learn what these different tools and techniques and frameworks talk about, and how you can enforce and ensure that your organization is free from this software supply chain security issues. Yeah.
Great. This would be the time where, if there are any questions from our viewers, we would be willing to entertain them. So if there are any questions, please type them into the window on the right, right in the comment section. In the meantime, I would say that, like we mentioned earlier, all the links that were mentioned in this webinar will be added in the show notes later, including the course. Obviously, if you want to try out the course, we would obviously add the link to it, as well as the link to Scribe Security, obviously, naturally. It is free to use. It's a very handy end-to-end security solution that handles a lot of what we talked about here today: hardening, SBOM generation, using that information, adding policies to your entire software development lifecycle. Essentially, a really, really handy tool. And the fact you could use it for free is a definite plus. Since I don't see currently any additional questions, I would like to say thank you so much to Imran for joining us. I know it's not easy for a CEO of a company to take time out of their busy schedule just to answer a few questions. So thanks again. And I would like to wish all our viewers a wonderful, safe, and secure day. And I'll see you on our next webinar.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye.